The main problem with the climate change debate is that it has focused solely and exclusively on alleged facts that are strictly scientific from the standpoint of the natural sciences, leaving aside the extremely important contribution that economic science has to make in this area. Now, within economics, there is in turn a very broad debate between what up to now has been considered the mainstream current, which is based on assuming that all the information needed to make political decisions is given and does not change, supported by equilibrium models, and the dynamic, entrepreneurial and creative approach of the Austrian School of Economics. This approach focuses on viewing the human being as an actor endowed with an innate creative capacity who is continuously able to discover new ends and, above all, new means to achieve those ends to which he assigns value. And it is precisely this creative capacity that makes it impossible to have a set of data to drive a social engineering agenda like the one all climate change ideologues intend to support. That is, the information needed to carry out this agenda is not given. Rather, it is being continuously changed by human beings as a result of their innate creative capacity. Basically, there are three reasons that explain why it is not possible for the state or governments to obtain the information they need to solve climate change, and they are also the arguments that explain the impossibility of socialism or of social organization based on the state. First, the enormous volume of information generated by 8 billion human beings from the moment they get up until they go to bed, although this is the least important argument. The following arguments are much more relevant, because that information is not information that can be objectified in a univocal way. It is subjective information, tacit information, a know-how that we humans acquire each time we have to face a problem, even if we are not capable of making it explicit and transmitting it to a central planning body. But in addition, the information that rulers would need to solve climate change is information that has not yet been created. It will depend on the entrepreneurial creativity of human beings as they confront or try to solve problems as they arise tomorrow. And lastly, and this is the definitive argument, it turns out that the state is coercion. This is something that is always overlooked, but the state implies the systematic use of violence, the official state bulletin, fines, prison, and so on, to impose by force the objectives set by those in power. And precisely this coercion and this violence, insofar as they affect the social body and the areas they touch, block the creation of information by ordinary human beings, which is exactly what the ruler needs, like rain in May, in order eventually to solve the problems of climate change. Therefore, this is an essential argument of economic science that up to now has been ignored or denied, and it is essential to take it into account to clarify what situation we are in and what possibilities there are for solving the problems that affect us. Entrepreneurial creativity has several extremely important facets, and it is that it explains the enormous capacity for adaptation that the human race has had throughout history. It means that the human being is capable of adapting successfully to changes in the natural environment. And the history of humanity is a history of successful adaptation precisely to the extent that it has been allowed to act freely. Because the great failures in human history are the result of state coercion, which ends up generating genocides, wars, and all kinds of social conflicts. So, the creativity above all of the human being explains that adaptation to the natural environment. But that creativity also expands. It expands progressively as the number of human beings increases, that is, the number of creative heads. We must bear in mind that the Earth is practically unpopulated in the vast majority of its surface. That is, the entire population of humanity would fit into a geographic area a little larger than half, for example, of Argentina, with the population density of Brussels. In other words, 8 billion human beings would fit into half of Argentina with the population density of Brussels, which means that the rest of the planet would be empty. It is perfectly possible to increase the human population tenfold, so that instead of being 8 billion, we become 80 billion, even 100-fold, 800 billion, in an explosion of creativity and prosperity, the likes of which we cannot even imagine today. In fact, the recent rise in population from the Industrial Revolution to the present has multiplied from under 1 billion to 8 billion, and this has been the result of opening only a tiny corner of the window of human creative freedom, because the liberal revolution began but could never be brought to completion, and it has faced all kinds of obstacles throughout the 20th century, which ended in the two world wars and, above all, in the irrational challenge posed by economic interventionism in any of its forms, whether the most extreme communism or social democracy. All of them join hands in the sense that they believe there must exist a monopolistic organ of violence known as the state, which must be tasked with detecting all problems, placing them on its agenda, and also being responsible for solving them. This is the serious mistake that, from the standpoint of economic science, a very important part of intellectuals, politicians, and people who in good faith follow their leadership are making at this moment, undoubtedly manipulated by a completely ideologized and politicized movement that is developing outside economic science, and which can have, and in fact does have, an enormous cost because, as I say, it continuously blocks the advance of prosperity and civilization. I have great affection for Julian Simon. I knew him personally. I met with him at several meetings of the Mont Pelerin Society. Julian Simon agreed with me in many areas of the approach of economic science. He was a great Hayekian and also a methodological optimist, something I share or shared with him, and he realized that the true resource is the creative human being, and that therefore population, far from posing a problem for prosperity, is the necessary condition for it to grow and for civilization to advance. So, therefore, poverty is not the result of population growth. It's only the result of socialism, or rather statism, of that interventionist agenda that the state wants to impose on us by force and that blocks creativity, which is the only explanation and the only cause of humanity's development. Julian Simon made this wager with Ehrlich, saying, "Look, faced with the doomsayers of the Club of Rome and all your writings where you claim the worst thing happening to humanity is that the population is growing and resources are going to run out, I bet you that human creativity will solve the problems, and that, far from what you indicate, in 25 years we will make a list and check whether all these supposedly scarce resources, minerals and so on, have disappeared, whether we are in a terrifying situation in which humanity's progress is halted or their price is through the roof. And I will pay you if that happens, or you will pay me. And in the end, as is only logical, he won the bet." What's incredible is that people still keep reading Ehrlich's books. I mean, those who for ideological reasons don't want to open their eyes are stubborn. First, to the historical facts that in some way completely refute his gloomy predictions. And above all, they don't even want to reason in terms of objective economic science, or understand the immense creative capacity of the human being, and also the coordinating capacity, because when we act entrepreneurially, we not only discover out of nowhere or create out of nowhere new information that advances civilization and the solution of problems, but simultaneously we coordinate previously misaligned human behaviors. If by capitalist system we mean what we should mean, an economy of the market based on private property and not intervened in by the states, then as prosperity develops, human beings' subjective valuation increases, as their standard of living rises, of the importance of having a clean environment from an ecological and environmental point of view. It is in poorer environments where, because there is more urgency to solve vital problems and people live at a subsistence level, these ecological and environmental objectives are pushed into the background or valued much less. Then, even for that reason, the economic development generated by capitalism explains progress, from gardens to the point where people are eager to spend the weekend out in the countryside or the mountains, highly value clean natural settings, and so on. But it's not only that. If we analyze historical facts, we realize that it is precisely those state interventionists who, in practice, end up posing the greatest threats to the environment. And we don't even need to mention, for example, the draining of the Aral Sea, which is a textbook case, or Chernobyl, which is also very well studied. Why? It's not because they are bad people. It's because, regardless of whether they are ideologically biased, since they act through violence and coercion in an environment of ineradicable uncertainty, where they lack the data to act correctly, it is scientifically impossible for them not to make mistakes and to cause environmental damage far greater than what they intend to prevent, by getting ahead of what they claim the market is damaging in a specific or temporary way in the natural environment. So then, in the end, as always happens with interventionism, interventionist measures produce effects that are exactly the opposite, and also more severe than those they were meant to avoid. And this happens in any area where the state intervenes in general, and specifically in the environmental sphere. And if not, just wait, especially when we see the effects that, ultimately, all this reckless intervention has. From setting a maximum deadline for manufacturing combustion engines. Why? And why not investigate, and if a combustion engine is found that pollutes much less, then what? And then, what effect might it have to place the entire bet on electric cars, when even now we cannot foresee the consequences, because relevant information may not be created or discovered? We are, in a way, strangling or blocking the only thing that can solve tomorrow's problems, or the ones already emerging today, which is our innate creative and entrepreneurial capacity, acting freely in a non-state intervened environment to detect problems as they arise, and to deploy every means to solve them creatively. Well, the case of Germany, actually I would say of the whole European Union, here the EU has made a very serious mistake, for political and ideologized reasons, in making the environment a top priority in its political reform agenda. And then, with completely reckless regulation, and also behind the backs of the population, a central population of millions of human beings, poorly informed, continually subjected to manipulation and to having the costs hidden from them, costs that in the end are already starting to appear and that citizens are beginning to discover, this entire scheme explains why the European economy suffers a level of regulation never seen before, which has affected its economic development. The economy has slowed, and in every member country there is a tremendous political problem, and perhaps this illness manifests itself with full virulence not only in France, which today is the great sick man of Europe, but above all in Germany, because it has been the EU's economic engine until now. Germany became, and for decades was, one of the world's exporters precisely because German entrepreneurs were forced to compete internationally in a very difficult environment in which their currency, at the time, the mark, kept appreciating, which is the hardest thing for an exporter. The only possibility they had, therefore, was to build muscle and to conceive and produce the highest quality products. And this is the reason German industry moved to the forefront of world industry as a leading exporter. What has happened? Well, different causes have played a role, from the generalized corruption of the euro, starting with Mario Draghi, which, by causing the euro to depreciate, made exporting extremely easy. One no longer had to develop entrepreneurial ingenuity to create the best product, because you sold everything. This is bread for today and hunger for tomorrow, because then you stop investing, innovating, etc., and you mortgage your future as a creative producing entrepreneur. But on top of that, totally ideologized and mistaken political decisions are made in the environmental sphere. Here, the effect, the influence, of the Green Party has been devastating. In the end, what it has driven, abandoning not only coal but also shutting down nuclear plants, etc., is that the price of energy becomes extremely high in Germany, and therefore it cannot compete. And many German companies are already considering that their only way out is to close their factories and move them or locate them elsewhere, in China, etc., where energy is much cheaper. Because economic development needs very abundant and cheap energy, and it is up to human creativity to discover what the main sources are and, through innovation, introduce alternative systems, etc., but without blocking economic development. Germany's situation, therefore, is now desperate. Even the European Union has voted tariffs on imports of automobiles. When we have seen that, when we did not need tariffs and were exporters, the Germans made the best cars in the world. And with the paradox that these tariffs were imposed because the Chinese are producing electric vehicles of much higher quality and cheaper. So what is it then? Isn't the top priority of Europe's ideologized and interventionist agenda to push the fight against climate change? If that goal is achieved, in their view, through electric vehicles, then welcome them. Who cares who produced them? If they are quality and they are made in China, then what one has to do, if one wants to be coherent and not contradictory with the objective of a clean environment, is to receive them with open arms and not place any kind of import tariffs on them. But what is intended with this is to encourage investment in Germany that reconverts all industries toward electric cars, and the only thing it is achieving is that factories close passively and, as Volkswagen has just announced, tens of thousands of workers are laid off. This reminds me, in economic terms and saving the distances, but as an analogy, of the fall of the Roman Empire. We could say, in the economic sphere, and in relation to what Germany represented industrially, how it is destroying its own fabric. And this, without a doubt, is having tremendous political effects in Germany. Polarization of society, boosting the most extremist political parties, etc. And as happens in Germany, it is happening in France, Italy, Spain, etc., all due to the reckless and ideologized, alarmist agenda of fighting climate change adopted by these green parties, and which has infiltrated like a lethal virus throughout the entire social body. In this sense, we can say we are at a historic moment. Our children and grandchildren will surely talk about this moment because, on what happens now, in these circumstances, where the citizens end up in the majority seeing the light and understanding that only through freedom, entrepreneurial creativity, and the process of voluntary cooperation that capitalism implies can problems be solved, or whether they do not see it, depends nothing less than the future of humanity. I mentioned it yesterday in class to my students. Let's see who has a phone. And they all held up their phones. And they all assumed that phones, with all the advantages they have brought into our lives, had always existed, and that everyone has the right to have a phone. And I pointed out that no, in my own life, not too many decades ago, 30 years, you could get stranded with your car on a road and you had to hitchhike to make a phone call. That we all have these enormous advances is the result of specific historical facts, and above all, of specific acts of entrepreneurial creativity. And we have Steve Jobs, who was a brilliant entrepreneur who went bankrupt twice, but got it right the third time. This whole structure through Apple, etc. And we can list many other examples. Today, there are creative entrepreneurs changing the future, and we must not take for granted that what we have achieved will remain that way. Because if this coercive state agenda, resulting from social engineering that today is embraced in practice by all parties that are statist, whether right or left, spreads, this entrepreneurial process is blocked. The creativity that gives the future is blocked. But what can also happen is that we go backwards. That is, what has been achieved in an environment of state intervention through a process of decumulation of capital and persecution of creative entrepreneurship may be dismantled little by little. That is what happened, for example, with the fall of the Roman Empire, or when the different socialist revolutions occurred. For example, in Portugal, I saw it. There was a very important volume of accumulated capital, and Portugal, after the Carnation Revolution, when communists and socialists took power, suffered a tremendous economic regression and collapse in living standards, and Portugal did not recover until now, when it has again timidly opened the doors of freedom within the European Union. So there is no guarantee that what has been achieved will be maintained if what created it, market economy and freedom of enterprise, is not maintained, and if on the contrary, it is persecuted. And whether we continue advancing tomorrow depends on these creative entrepreneurs. We can also give some examples, paradigmatic examples, like Elon Musk. He can be criticized or have a more or less extravagant personality, but what cannot be denied is his entrepreneurial capacity, his personal drive, his vision of things that nobody is able to imagine could be done, and how he can put them into practice. Because, it's even surprising how he launches a satellite or a rocket and how, privately, through his engineers, he has managed for at least the first stage of the rocket to return exactly to the launch pad, something astonishing, which has also left NASA engineers and all state agencies, which are lavishly financed with everyone's money, open-mouthed. In the end, an entrepreneur makes the difference between progress and creativity, between life and death.